In Germany, people often tell me, "Hey Tony, the pressure of raising a child is just too much." And every time I tell them, "You're wrong. That's only because you haven't raised a child in China. If you did, you would know what hell mode parenting really looks like." In this video, I will explain in detail exactly how much effort parents in China have to put in to raise a child. China's 2025 fertility data has been released, showing just over 7 million births. What kind of scale is this? It's equivalent to China's birth numbers in 1738. But back then, China's population was only 100 million, while today it is 1.4 billion. From this, we can calculate a total fertility rate of 0.97. But we all know, for a country to maintain a stable population, that rate needs to be at 2.1. That is the level required for normal replacement. Among the developed countries we know, the US is at 1.62, Australia at 1.45, and Germany, where I live, is at 1.35. Clearly, China is lower than almost all developed nations. This is counterintuitive. We usually expect people in developed countries to be less willing to have children, while in undeveloped regions, fertility rates remain very high. Even when South Korea was at the same stage of development as China is now, its fertility rate was still 1.54. Looking at it this way, the decline in China's fertility rate is somewhat terrifying and even eerie. You should know that the Chinese are practically the most pro-childbirth people in the world. During World War II, China's fertility rate was as high as 5 to 6. So why are Chinese people unwilling to have babies now? The answer is actually very simple. It's just too expensive. So, how high is the cost of raising a child in China? First, according to a Chinese research report, the average cost of raising a child from birth to adulthood is 538,000 yuan. However, in reality, according to China's social norms, if a child doesn't start working at 18 and continues their education, parents will keep supporting them, often until they finish graduate school. But let's look at the standard case in most countries, where parents provide support until college graduation. In China, that cost reaches 680,000 yuan. And what does this cost mean in the context of China? A report from CICC shows that only 220 million people in China earn more than 3,000 yuan a month. Given a total population of 1.4 billion, earning over 3,000 yuan puts you in the top 20% of income earners. So, if you earn over 3,000 yuan and your wife also earns over 3,000, yours is considered a relatively well-off family in China. We can calculate roughly. With a combined family income of 6,000 RMB a month, it would take about 9 years without spending a single cent on anything else, just to raise one child. At first glance, this figure might not seem too exaggerated, as it's quite similar in many developed nations. But here is the catch. The 680,000 yuan we mentioned is only the national average, and that high income of 3,000 yuan is mostly concentrated in major cities like Beijing and Shanghai. In these places, the cost of raising a child is exceptionally high. For instance, in Shanghai, the cost to raise a child to age 17 reaches 1 million yuan. And in Beijing, it's 930,000. If you include university expenses, that cost climbs to 1.3 million. Therefore, The high-income group we just discussed isn't facing a 680,000 yuan price tag, but rather 1.3 million. This equates to nearly 20 years of a couple's total income without spending a single cent on anything else. Of course, besides the financial cost, there is also the cost of time. However, since the time cost is essentially the same all over the world, I won't highlight it specifically here. Special mention must be made of the housing issue. In China, if you want to get married, buying a house is an absolute requirement. This is an ironclad rule. I have many older friends in Germany and the UK who have never owned a home in their entire lives. They simply rent forever. But in China, this is impossible. Without a house, you are unlikely to get married. I have seen so many cases where a couple in love was forced apart by their parents simply because they didn't own a home. Therefore, for every Chinese person, not only must they buy a house for themselves, but they must also help their children buy one. Because if you don't help your child secure a house, they will fundamentally struggle to buy one while they are still young, and they won't be able to get married either. So sometimes I find myself wondering, is marriage in China pure? Are people getting married because of the house? Or is it because of love? Why not just marry the house? So, how much does a house cost? In 2025, the national average housing price in China is 9,650 yuan per square meter, with an average size of 115 square meters. This means the average property costs around 1.11 million yuan. Considering the reality that a couple usually shares one home, this cost can be split between two children. Therefore, on average, the cost of raising each child increases by another 555,000 yuan. Additionally, China has a unique bride price system, where the groom must provide a large sum of money to the bride's family to marry. This, too, is usually covered by the parents. But since the amounts vary wildly by region, I won't go into detail here. So, if we look only at the averages, raising a child in China to adulthood, putting them through university, and finally helping them get married will cost at least 1.2 million RMB. Of course, if we look at the situation in major cities, these expenses will only be even higher. To give you a clearer sense of the pressure, let's compare child rearing costs globally. Reports show that based purely on the ratio of cost to GDP per capita, China's burden is the second highest in the world, trailing only South Korea. However, GDP per capita is a flawed metric because it doesn't reflect actual disposable income. The ratio of disposable income to GDP varies wildly by country. It's about 78% in the US and 65% in Germany, while in China, it's less than 40%. This means if we look at actual disposable income, the situation in China is significantly worse. How extreme is it? In 2025, China's GDP per capita is 100,000 yuan, which translates to a disposable income of just 40,000 yuan. For a couple, that's a combined 80,000 yuan a year. Now, let's categorize child rearing costs into 3 tiers. Raising a child to age 18, to university graduation, and finally, to marriage, including a house. This means you must dedicate 37.5%, 38.75%, or a staggering 69.8%
0.87% of your total household income to a single child every year. At this point, it's no longer about whether parents are willing to invest. It's about whether they can even survive. In contrast, this figure is only 19% in the US, 8% in Germany, and averages around 15% for OECD countries. Looking at these numbers, I can't help but reflect. The pressure of raising a child in Germany is actually only about 1/8 of what it is in China. Yet, our fertility rate is only 1.35. If Germany faced the same pressure as China, I suspect there wouldn't be a single person left in this country in 100 years. It seems only the Chinese people could endure such conditions.
But then again, what makes Chinese people bear such a heavy burden of child rearing? The answer is actually very simple. It is a plunder by the Chinese government. This is presented through two aspects. One is plunder from the GDP. The other is the lack of government welfare. Specifically, the Chinese government collects high taxes, but it is a low welfare government. On the surface, China's tax rate doesn't seem high, but this involves the tax system with Chinese characteristics, which I will talk about later. Those who want to hear it, please follow me. Okay, I've strayed too far. Let's talk again about how the Chinese government squeezes the Chinese people. As we already said, the ratio of Chinese people's disposable income to GDP is 40%. However, let's make a hypothesis. If that ratio could reach 80%, like in the US, the cost of child rearing would drop to 20%. This is already close to the level of developed countries. In addition, the welfare systems of some countries make up for this problem. In Germany, where I live, childbirth, medical, and education fees do not regard you to pay a single cent. For instance, parents receive at least 300 euros a month, and for children, there is a benefit of 250 euros every month until they are 18. In contrast, what about China? It's just a 300 RMB monthly subsidy. To be honest, this is only enough to buy a bag of powdered milk. So I really feel emotional once again. Faced with this bottomless exploitation, Chinese people did not choose to resist. Instead, they used the power of 6 wallets to raise a child. The government's lack of responsibility is made up for by parents and grandparents sacrificing their quality of life. I find it hard to imagine, if the German government were like the Chinese government, how long would the Germans be striking and protesting? And what is most ironic is that a large portion of the money the Chinese government plunders is spent on stability maintenance. In other words, the Chinese people are paying their own money to have the government hold a club and beat them with it. One can only say this is quite a piece of black humor. At the end of the program, I want to say that the Chinese government's system of exploitation is slowly becoming unsustainable. The sharp annual decline in the birth rate is clear evidence of this. And I estimate that in a few more years, China may actually overtake South Korea's throne for the world's lowest fertility rate. How will the Chinese government respond to this? Will those measures actually be effective in the end? I remember the Romanian dictator Ceausescu used menstrual police to inspect women's wombs and menstrual cycles back then to increase the birth rate. Will China move toward that step in the future? At that time, I fear it will be another humanitarian disaster. And the terrifying thing is that such disasters have happened repeatedly on the land of China.